welcome to Book Club. Thanks for sticking with us. After our break last week, we have about 1.5 chapters left, so we're going to plow ahead and maybe wrap up today, or maybe do part of it and go for some questions. It'll kind of depend. We'll see where the night takes us. All right, so let's get back to things. Last time we were looking at the end of chapter 7, design patterns. We were on page 167, finishing up the proxy model, which we thought was cool and fully support, if you remember that. So this week we're starting on the mediator pattern. So there are 2 more patterns in this section. One of them is sneak preview. One of them is alright. The other is a little confusing, and then he combines them and just totally, I don't know, we'll get there. It gets really confusing. So let's talk about the mediator pattern. So the idea here is that it promotes loose coupling and improves maintainability. And the way that it does this is with a central object that handles events coming from all different areas and distributes the data accordingly. So I mean, a game is example here, which is great because that's exactly the type of use case for something like this. There's actually live source for this stuff, which is kind of cool. I don't remember there being a lot in the rest of the book, so it's
there actually are live examples for all the rest of the book, but he has never discussed it until this point.
Yeah, all of a sudden there's links to live examples, so that's cool. Excuse me, and they are still up. I looked just before this to make sure. So alright, so what's happening here is you have a player constructor, and with properties, points, and name. Oh, I should probably explain what this game is. Does he say yet? Okay, so the game is 2 players are given 30 seconds to compete for who will press a button more times than the other. And like Shane said earlier, the winner is the guy who just fires a key press event in a jQuery loop, but that's neither here nor there, I guess. Player 1 completes by pressing 1, player 2 presses 0. The scoreboard is set up and updated with the current score. So basically you've got 2 listeners, one on the 1 key and one on the 0 key. And then you've got a scoreboard, and you've got this mediator object that looks for these events and then fires off what happens when they happen. So scrolling down to the bottom of 169, you have a player function. It's got points and a name, and it has a play function on the prototype. And the play function adds a point, and it calls played on the mediator object. So the mediator object is really what we're focusing on here. Then you have a scoreboard object that updates the score display, which is fine. Here's the real meat of it. You've got this mediator object. So the player is the one that fires this. So it fires mediator.played. Mediator.played sets the score object and then updates the scoreboard. So instead of the player objects updating the scoreboard directly, you have this sort of core of the game that everything is going through, and so the players are talking to the mediator and the mediator is talking to the scoreboard. It's pretty simple. So then you have these, mediator also handles your key press events so that these aren't cluttering up your player object or your scoreboard object. And the way that he's got this written is a little bit clunky, but 2 if statements with returns in them is not the best way to do this. But he's just looking for key codes and then playing the home or the guest depending on what the key code is. So it's hard coded in there. It's not the cleanest way to do it, but I think it gets the concept across here fairly well, which is the idea of this mediator. And then you've got this, a setup, and then you just have a set timeout. It just goes. And once the timeout is over, then it changes the window key press to null. So the window key press equals mediator key press just means that the mediator key press is going to fire whenever there's any sort of key hit in the window. Simple. I mean, I like this example. It's got some hard-coded parts, but They are, he doesn't need to get complicated in those parts, so he just sets this concept up and delivers it in a simple manner. So the observer pattern is decidedly less simple and elegant. So again, this is to promote loose coupling. Instead of one object calling another object's method, an object subscribes to another object's specific activity and gets notified. And by subscribing, okay, his terminology gets really weird here because this example is built around magazine subscriptions, which are also subscriptions, but he keeps using the term subscribe in areas that don't relate to the actual abstraction of the implementation. So terminology here gets hairy, let's say. But alright, so the publisher notifies, so the publisher is your core object. It calls all of the subscribers that are registered within it whenever an event occurs and might pass a message or data or something. So here's the example number one, which is magazine subscriptions. Again, this example is abstracted in a very strange way and not particularly easy to follow. So we're going to cut to the core of this stuff. Alright, you have subscribers. A paper has subscribers. It has an unsubscribe and subscribe method. It has a publish method. And what that does is it runs through its subscribers and calls all the methods that they provided. So basically, here, this hopefully will make it simpler. Bottom of page 172, you've got this subscribe function, and what it's doing is it's looking to see if there's a type specified. If there isn't one, it just calls it any. And then if the type is not defined yet, so if you've got this.subscribers type, so because subscribers is an object that starts out with an array that associates with the key any, and then if there's if it doesn't say you passed in subscribe and then you pass a function and then news or something, then it's going to make a new attribute in the subscribers object that's then going to be an array of functions, and it's going to push to that function. So what the publisher here is doing is queuing up functions within different arrays, so then it can loop through those arrays. So you're registering events basically.
Shouldn't this example always write to any as well as writing it to the optionally supplied type?
What, just because of the abstraction of it?
Well, I mean, in the real world example of this, if you want to send something out to subscribers that have subscribed to any type of subscription, then you're going to fire all the any methods.
Well, that's one of the many problems with the way this is written is these actions in this example don't make practical sense, which makes it a little hard to figure out. So you kind of have to look past that and just look at the implementation, because his example abstraction, it makes it more confusing, I think, rather than less. Because you end up with papers that publish, but they publish strings, and then you make them a publisher, and then you have this guy, and he drinks coffee. It's oof. So we're going to try to focus on the techniques here that are useful, and not necessarily the abstract example. And so what's important here is that this subscribe function basically files the function away within this subscribers object, and it will put itself in a new category if there isn't one yet. And then once it creates one or uses an existing one, it pushes it to the array. So you end up with the subscribers object with all these categories of subscribers, and then within that there's the array of the actual function that needs to be fired. If that makes sense. It's a lot of abstraction, a lot of categorizing all of your actions into one object, so that then when you need to fire something for a particular group of objects, you do it once. This part of it is actually awful, and I just want to point out what's going on here at the top of page 173. This is within the visit subscribers function, which again isn't really a good term for what's going on here, because it's not just visiting the subscribers, it's performing an action on them. What it's doing is it's walking through, say we're in this subscribers.any. It'll go through all the subscribers that are in the array that's in this .subscribers.any, and it's going to perform an action on them. Well, the way that this is written, it says if the action is publish, then you call the argument, or you pass in the argument on those subscribers. But if it's not, then it deletes them. So instead of, because up here, he actually has an unsubscribe and a publish function, but it appears that the way this is written, the default action is to unsubscribe. If publish isn't specified, then it unsubscribes. It's weird. Like, this whole section seems like he may not have fully edited it or gone through it multiple times, or maybe thought of an entirely different way to bring this pattern to the forefront. So again, and really it only gets worse, but then it gets better, but first it gets worse. So this part's kind of interesting. You've got right after that code block of confusingness, this make publisher function basically just walks through an object and attaches all of the publisher's methods onto that object. Now, one downside of the way he's doing this here is he's not checking to see if those methods exist already. So you could potentially overwrite. So in his example, he has a paper object with daily and monthly attributes that are functions. But say he had an object that already had a visit subscribers attribute, that would be overwritten with the way that this make publisher method is being written.
Yeah.
I mean, the idea of there being a standalone function that will copy all the methods from one object to another object for you is an interesting one, and sort of its own pattern, but he just sticks it in the middle here, and not in a very practical way, or usable way.
Yeah, he also doesn't have any way of going down recursively through nested objects.
Yeah.
So it's only going to work for a very specific case.
Right, so if an object has a child that's also an object, because stuff's passed by reference, that wouldn't necessarily be copied properly.
You should probably just have a constructor
Yeah.
for this.
Yeah, jQuery has if you need to clone objects, jQuery does have a clone method that will handle recursively going through stuff. I think you have to pass true as the second argument, but that's way more usable than this. This is the bare minimum of what you would need to do this kind of thing. Sorry, there's also extend in jQuery, which will merge objects together for you, which is more of what's happening here. But again, that's sort of like a micro pattern within this bigger picture. Alright, so this is where it gets more and more abstract in a way that doesn't really help you understand how this is done particularly well. Because you have this paper object, and it publishes strings, and then you make that a publisher, which attaches all the publisher's methods on it, and then you have this guy. Look, the point of this is that you're queuing up methods. That's really what this all comes down to, is you're providing yourself a way to have an array of references to functions, so that then when you want to call something, it'll just walk through that whole array and fire the appropriate method on everything. The fact that it's a weird newspaper example is really neither here nor there.
In the most generic sense, this is how jQuery handles attaching events.
Yeah, and so we will get into that. What's funny is that would be a perfect, like if he had done this with event queuing, that would have been a really perfect avenue to take. I think he may not have done it because that's more of a DOM situation, but he does get into event queuing in the next chapter a little bit. So that actually, so if you can picture a situation where you have an on-click event, you can't, with jQuery you can just attach an event, and jQuery actually queues it into an array of on-click events that need to be fired when a particular thing happens. Because if you were to assign it directly to on-click, then it would overwrite whatever was previously there. But that's sort of this pattern. Yeah, that's a good example of how this pattern would actually be used. So let's move on, because I hope that we kind of extracted the essence for you here. I think that if you look into how events are queued up in jQuery, that would probably be more in line than this newspaper example is. And plus, I really want to get to this part because I will say I haven't officially bailed on any section in here, and I'm bailing on this section for you guys because it's really, really weird. So we already have this subscriber, publisher, newspaper abstraction that is weird and doesn't really work. And then you have the key press game, which does work and is implemented in a way that helps him explain that particular pattern. So now he's combining those two, but he's maintaining a bunch of the terminology from the newspaper game. So you still have this publisher object that still has subscribers, but now he's changed the names of some other functions in it, but he still has a visit subscribers. So it just seems unfinished. It's like he took his example and didn't want to rename everything because he thought it might be too confusing, so he renamed some of it. So some of it has to do with newspapers and some of it has to do with the key press game, and at the end of the day, it makes this example really hard to parse.
The publisher and subscribers, I mean, that technically could be kept the same naming because, but I mean, you're subscribing events using this publisher object, but yeah, visit subscribers should have probably been renamed.
Yeah, and this actually goes back to what I was saying, which is, excuse me, while publisher and subscribers are okay names for queuing up items, when your example also involves publishers and subscribers that are newspapers, publisher and person subscribers,
Yeah.
and then you have like an event publisher and event subscriber, it's funky. There are a couple things in here that are useful. For example, the fire function. If you scroll down to when that's actually used in the player object, we're at the 176. Instead of firing to a mediator event, it actually is calling the fire method and then firing the play function. So what it's actually doing is attaching attaching the play method to itself. Wait, crap. No, I forgot what I was going to say about this. Yeah, so this is part of the other problem is you go back up here to fire and then it's calling this visit subscribers, then the word publish again.
Yeah, and passing in the type of play, or no, new player or play depending.
Yeah. So what it's doing is instead of just firing it, it's calling visit subscribers. Visit subscribers is then looking through the subscribers array and firing that appropriate function on the matching object.
Yeah, so it's going to go to the array of play off of subscribers and then fire the message on that.
So yeah, so at the end of the day, you've got an object that fires a function that looks for an array that fires a function. Suffice to say, this isn't the greatest example. Also, this is starting to feel really gross and Java-y to me, where it's just walking through thing after thing after thing and eventually getting somewhere.
Here he's substituting this long nesting of objects for going 2 or 3 nested objects deep in one and calling a method that calls a method that's 2 or 3 objects deep on another one.
I don't think that this particular example justifies this coding pattern, even though it arguably is useful in some cases. Especially after how clean this little simple game was with the mediator pattern. So that's what I mean by bailing. I think that this example is more complicated than the concept requires, and therefore doesn't do a good job justifying either. Really.
Yeah, and he proceeds to put a nested while loop inside.
Oh yeah, just as a cherry on this chapter.
You're gonna love this.
Yeah. Well, let me finish this real quick. So this is the actual handler. I don't know. It calls back to the publisher, and then you've got this make publisher function, yeah, it just goes and goes. It doesn't justify itself. All right, so just because we're vindictive, in the middle of page 177, there is a crazy implementation that is not what you should do ever at all, where he's nested 2 while loops in order to, instead of using a set or a set interval or something, it's actually just busting through these 2 while loops, waiting for something to happen, and then when that does happen, it breaks out of the while loop and makes a new player. Don't do this. Don't put while 1 and then do a thing until it breaks according to an event.
Yeah, I mean, call prompt the first time, and then have your if and else conditions, and the else condition call the prompt again.
Yeah, or have a function fire on a key press. It doesn't need to be sitting there looping for forever. It's just there are like 3 or 4 different ways to do this that aren't ridiculous. I'm pretty sure that goes for any language, but especially one that's sitting there client side and looping a while loop. You shouldn't just sit there with something that says while true or something and then waiting for something within a conditional to go false. What do you think, Paul?
It's terrible.
I like how he saved 3 precious bytes
Paul said it's terrible.
by doing a truthy value of 1 instead of just a boolean
Yeah,
true.
exactly.
It's great.
And it's not even changing that value, obviously. It's just eventually breaking.
Yeah, it's just breaking out of the loop.
And really, you shouldn't be using break except in switch statements. So, lots of weird things. Like I said, I'm not necessarily faulting the author for not knowing what he's doing, but it does feel rushed.
It reminds me of PHP.
All right. Excuse me. All right, we're gonna skip through the summary because most of that is 2 weeks old, and we're not gonna require you guys to remember that.
Watch the previous episode.
Yeah, watch it on previously on Book Club. We went through the rest of that chapter. It was awesome. Wait, you went through the rest of that chapter, right? Or
Yeah,
was that
it
the
was
one?
you.
It was me. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, we have plenty of time to look at something a lot more lightweight and fun, which is finally some DOM and browser patterns. And a lot of this chapter is going to be things that jQuery handles for you, or whatever your preferred library is. We use jQuery, but it's still worth knowing what's going on behind the scenes for sure, so you understand kind of what's happening within jQuery or your library. Because the libraries tend to handle use cases for how different browsers access things. They handle when you're walking through the DOM, they'll use whichever selector is faster if possible, but it still pays to know which one is being used. Stuff like that. So let's get into it. Because this, at least to us here at Hashrocket, is where the proverbial rubber meets the proverbial road. So we're going to go to page 182. Right. I want to make a disclaimer here. He talks about separating concerns, which is great. Separating your display code from your interaction code from your backend code. However, he talks about testing with JavaScript turned off and making sure the page can still perform its main purpose. We don't test with JavaScript off, mainly, because the percentage of users with JavaScript off is incredibly small, and we write typically very complex applications that require JavaScript. And I mean, there's really actually not even a good way to tell how many of your users have JavaScript off, because not even Google Analytics will run if JavaScript is turned off. So
Somebody recently brought up the case where you have a JavaScript error on the page that prevents all of your other JavaScript from loading.
yes,
Which
we write JavaScript that doesn't have errors is the solution to that.
right, yeah, we do test all of our JavaScript.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
And we have testing coverage that handles interactions that are dependent on JavaScript.
Right.
So ideally, we are never running
We do
stuff.
that, but
Yes.
not everybody does. Of course,
That's
if
true.
you're going through the trouble of test with and without JavaScript, then you'll probably already have a test suite. So
Yeah.
doing both is
Yeah. More power to you if you want to reach out to that tiny and awful bitter selection of people in the world who have JavaScript off.
Also known as other developers that
yes.
test JavaScript turned off.
Basically, that's another theory that we have, is that most people with JavaScript turned off are just developers checking to see if things work without JavaScript on.
And shaking their fist when it doesn't.
Anyway, the JavaScript, what he says here is good though. The JavaScript layer being unobtrusive shouldn't be in the way of the user, shouldn't make the page unusable in unsupported browsers, and it shouldn't be a requirement for the page to work. Also, we also talk about unobtrusiveness in terms of it not, you not having inline JavaScript within your code, like JavaScript being kept in its own special place. We don't use any inline JavaScript, so there's that. So here's capability detection to handle browser's differences elegantly, and again, browser differences should be handled elegantly by YUI and jQuery and new tools or whatever it is that you're using that you kids use these days. So the anti-pattern here is a good one. Don't ever look for the user agent. That's just not a it's not a clean or nice way to handle browser detection. Better, he's looking for the existence of a method. More specifically, he's looking to make sure that that method is not undefined. Best, which isn't on here because he's wrote this whole section to be ambivalent to what kind of library you're using. Best is jQuery does have a support method that allows you to just check to see what of various types of functions are supported. And that's the best way. Like if you really need to find out what kind of browser you're dealing with, go look at the jQuery support docs, and I'm assuming there's equivalents in other libraries, and it'll allow you to see what's supported where and sort of deduce what browser is happening through that.
If you do need more granular determination of,
Speak up.
if you need more granular determination of what browsers actually support, there's another library called Modernizer.
Oh yeah, Modernizer.
We don't use it here, but
That's Modernizer with a ZR at the end, no
Yeah.
E because of the
It's,
internet.
it's a really cool project. If you need to do that kind of checking,
Yeah.
it's a good place to look.
So there you go. People have done this work for you. So don't be looking at user agent.
Yeah, well, this first example, I mean, you open up Safari, fire up the developer tools, and just change the user agent. And for all the script knows, you're using Internet Explorer.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it supports the box model. So as jQuery checks, it wouldn't be fooled by that sort of change, whereas this would.
So it's checking for core functionality instead of just a string that happens to be set as one value or another within your browser. I know Opera used to have just like it was like one of the main menu drop downs to impersonate a whole bunch of different browsers. So that'll just screw up all your browser detection. Not that anyone's using Opera, but you know. So let's keep going. DOM access, which I think is really key to using jQuery to this section, and hopefully we're just talking about things you already know, but who knows? Maybe you'll learn something. This is, and it kind of stinks that he put all this stuff at the end of the book, but maybe I'm biased. So the anti-pattern here is to sit there and walk through 100 elements, sit there and walk through and add numbers to a result. It's something with the idea of result. So you're sitting there and you're firing inner HTML, or you're changing inner HTML every single time you walk through. Better, you update a local variable called content, and then once you're done, you attach it to the actual DOM. So the idea here, and he has another example that's also good, is do all of your manipulation before you get to the DOM, and then once you're done, stick the thing into the browser. But you can do everything beforehand, and I'll show you how to do that with jQuery. It's really easy. Similar thing in the next example. We're going to, alright, so he talks about, let's see, top of 184. He talks about query selector method. This is something that if you're using library you don't need, but what he points out here is good. If you access something by ID using jQuery or whatever, that's going to be the fastest because it's a direct call to the built-in browser function, get element by ID. If you walk through with a query selector, depending on what browser is being used, jQuery will use different methods to get to the item. But as a general rule, searching by ID is the fastest, class is the second fastest, and if you just are looking for an element, like if you just look for div, that's the slowest. Also, here I'll put up the
Yeah, I think attribute
there's
selectors
some
are the
bonus
slowest.
info here. Yeah, is this big enough to see? This is as big as I can get it.
Oh,
Yeah.
yep, just.
Alright, cool. So,
Yeah, I can read it.
okay. Anyway, this is the fastest. If you want to look for something within header, say you just want to get the nav element within header, that's going to be the fastest way to get to it, because basically jQuery already can scope to the ID, and then it doesn't have to look through the whole document to get whatever other element. So even in a situation where, say you have a table in the body, and it's the only table, maybe it's the only table on the page, you don't want to look for it by here. Maybe you can do, if you have a wrapper div, you can do wrapper table, and you've just cut down how, like now jQuery knows that it knows to look with, or it knows to look within this wrapper div, or something like that. So there are ways to utilize the ID to cut down on how much of the document jQuery needs to look through. And again, this probably applies in some way to other libraries, but the key is that ID is always the fastest. You really should never be walking through a whole document, especially if it's really big, to get something else, like a list item or something. You should scope it first and then look for the list item. Excuse me. So here's how not to append nodes. And so I'm going to show you how he says not to append nodes, and then I'll show you how he says to append nodes, and I'll show you how you can do it with jQuery that's even easier. So you shouldn't append nodes like this. He's creating an element, he's creating a text node, he's appending it to the element, and then he's appending that to the document. A better version will be to create a document fragment, update it offline, and add it to the live DOM with nested ready. So this idea of a document fragment versus a document element is all handled abstractly by jQuery. But so when you add a document fragment, the content of the fragment gets added, not the fragment itself. So basically, you're creating a piece of a document that does not get put into the DOM until you actually append it. So again, this goes back to what I was saying, like when you're creating a new element, get it done, get all your manipulation done before you go screwing with the DOM rendering, so you only have to do that once. So in this example, live documents updated only once, causing a single reflow repaint as opposed to one for every paragraph, as was the case in the previous statement. So here's how this is done in jQuery. You don't have to worry about this create document fragment versus create element business. jQuery means you just wrap a tag. Here, we'll make a div. So this is how you create a new div in jQuery. Now this div is not attached to the document, it's just existing. It's been wrapped and created, and it's ready to go. Like right now, you can use that to, and you can append it to the content right now. But you can do, say you want to make a div, you want to make a div, you want to add a class of pretty, and you want to add some text in it, and you want it to be appended to content. Well, do all that stuff before you append it. So you can say, text, so pretty. So there, you just made a div, you've got a class and some content in it, and then once you have all of that done, then you append it. Now, and then that way the document is only being rewritten once. Like there are a bunch of other ways to do this that are less preferable, but this is the recommended cleanest way to add a new document element with jQuery. So there you go. Bonus knowledge. Let's see, we have about 12 minutes. We might actually get through the rest of this because he just sort of starts shotgunning stuff all over the place at this point. Events, so he talks about it being full of inconsistencies and a source of frustration. Totally is. Again, like he says, the JavaScript library can take away much of the double work. Like we talked earlier about event queuing, but we'll go over the main points, like he says, because it pays to know what's actually going on behind the scenes. So here you have event handling. You have a button with an ID of quick me. You want to add a quick function onto it. Well, you can assign a function to the onClick property of the node, but that will overwrite whatever else is on the node. Like the node is just an object, and the object just has a onClick property. So if you do it like this, If there's any other click handler, it overwrites it. That sucks. It's a bad way to write code. So there's an add event listener method. There's an attach event method that's used in IE. This is all stuff that's handled in jQuery. So instead of all of this, you can just use the click method, or you can use the bind method, or you can use the live method if you're doing AJAX calls. And jQuery will handle this browser-specific stuff, and it'll handle adding it to a queue, and it'll handle all of that stuff, so that you can just say, button.click, and then pass it a function. And jQuery will take that function, add it to the list of things that get executed when button.click is called, or when the button's clicked on. So, but that's what it's actually doing behind the scenes, and that's the reason that it's necessary, or it's really helpful to have something like jQuery is, in case you have multiple events on something, and the way that events are added is different depending on whether you're using IE or not. So, yay, browser library, so you don't have to worry about that. So there you go, that's that section, piece of cake. And then you can see what other stuff you would have to deal with if you weren't using a library on page 187, because he's got, he has to handle propagation and all sorts of other stuff. And this is all stuff that, jQuery provides you. When you make a new function for a click function, and the function itself will receive the event object, and then you can call stop propagation or prevent default as necessary to keep other stuff from happening. But yeah, jQuery just smooths out this whole process, so you don't have to deal with some of these edge cases. Excuse me. And the rest of that I'll leave as an exercise to the reader. Event delegation is pretty interesting. So what's happening here is he's got 3 buttons that respond, and they're within a div. So instead of having a click event on each button, he's attaching one click event to the div, and then looking to see what actually got clicked on. This is a pretty useful pattern. If you have an area with a bunch of controls, you can just attach a click event around them, and then once it's clicked, like I said in jQuery, and I'll do it right here. Hopefully you know about this, but let's see. Button. Color. So you're passing. So there would be a basic click handler, but you can also pass in E, and that's given to you for free, and that's the event object. So then you can actually look at the target. I'm not going to do it right here, but this is going to be your target, and you can check to see what actually got clicked on. So if this is if this is a div controls, so it's a controls div, you can actually check using e.target to see what control in particular you clicked on. And it's really just a way to clean up the code. And I'm not sure, do you think there's any real performance hit difference between having separate events on everything?
I don't know. There might be, depending on how complex your application is, but
Yeah.
But you also gotta worry about how many DOM elements it needs to bubble out from before it finally reaches the event handler.
Yeah, so if you're thinking that the way that you're like, yay, I only need one event handler on my whole page, and then I can just check to see what actually was clicked on, and then the function will handle it. That's not a good thing to do.
Functions.
Yeah, don't do that. But this is just a way, if you happen to have a bunch of quick events that are very similar or in the same location, and you feel like it might be a cleaner, more readable solution to handle them all within one quick handler. And there you go. Alright. I'm not even sure if we're going to have enough for next week. There's a little bit about minifying, there's some stuff about remote scripting workers.
Set timeout, we've already gone over
Yeah,
that.
we kind of already went over set timeout earlier in the book. Anything to say about web workers?
Well, he's trying to cover all the stuff that's supported by all modern browsers and this is not
Yeah.
supported, so I don't know why he's going through it.
Like I said, it's really just, you know, whatever is left in his bucket, he's dumping it out here
He
at the end of the
needed
book.
to fill up 200 pages.
Yeah, that might actually be what's happening. The remote scripting stuff is the XML HTTP request business. That's all handled by Ajax libraries these days.
Well, and now they're going to have XML HTTP request 2
Oh, really? Awesome.
in ECMAScript 5, so this is all going to change if you're doing this from scratch.
Right. There's some JSON stuff. I sort of didn't see anything that really stuck out to me in the last few.
Yeah, I think this sort of stuff, I mean, in the beginning of the book, he covers the fact that, you know, this is not an introductory book, you should know all these things to begin with, so you should know how JSON is constructed and how to parse through it.
Arguably, you should also know, I mean, I don't think that he got very deep in his DOM manipulation area. Like, you get to the end of this book that has some really fairly advanced stuff in it, and then he's telling you that you should look for IDs first and stuff that should be like the first thing that you learn with DOM manipulation, so that's a little weird. The combining scripts at the end is just performance optimization stuff, same with minifying, which you already talked about, same with the expire stuff. Using a content delivery network, look into S3, it's cool. Some loading strategies.
CloudFront is an actual solution.
Oh yeah, CloudFront, yeah. And then the chunking thing is strange. I mean, have you really ever run into using this in the real world? No? Okay. Our attitude about chunking is, meh. And I'm gonna call it. I really am. I really appreciate anybody out there who's, we've got a couple of viewers. We have significantly less viewers than when we started this, but we were sort of expecting that. I mean, JavaScript isn't very popular among developers or designers, but that's why we're doing this, is hopefully we can put these out there and they'll be a place of reference for developers who are curious about front-end stuff and designers who are curious about code. And hopefully you've learned something with us in these many weeks. So thanks for listening and watching, people. And these will be, you know, archived on our site and stuff like that. Do we have, this is something I've been forgetting to do every week, and we only have 4 viewers, so we might not have any. But do we have any questions or comments? Anybody? It's super pathetic that I'm asking now, because I'm pretty sure all 4 of the viewers are in this room.
Well, I think 2 of them are,
2 of them?
Yeah.
All right.
unless you're on
Anybody out there?
us at 3.
This is just the most poetically perfect way to end this book club, is with absolutely no one
With
watching.
only Hashrocket employees watching.
With only Hashrocket employees watching.
We get a lot of views on Vimeo.
Oh, good. All right. Well, people on Vimeo, if you happen to make it to the end of this one, which I will be amazed if you do, email us, hit us up on Twitter, say something nice, ask us questions, and complain if you thought we were too mean or dumb. And thanks. I guess that's it. We'll shut it down. Shut it all down. All right.
Done.
Bye.